Hey. Hello to you 1,100 Ethicuties out there and the 40% of you who have not hit the subscribe button yet. Welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. We have a great treat for you today. I know I say that every week, but I really mean it this week. We have Karen here, we have Matt here, and we're going to be talking about a bunch of hot topics. We were talking in the green room before this, how this is really the best field to be in because there's always something new going on and always something to adjust to. So as we're going through our introductions, as always, like we like to say on the Ethicsverse, your network is your net worth, and neither are big enough. So drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat and connect with at least one person here today. Let's keep those emojis going. We had a near record last week. We got a bunch of big brains, at least 2 big brains on today, but keep your conversations coming in the chat. We want to incorporate those things. And, you know, this is our place to meet every week, right? This is the place for ethics and compliance and human resource and employee relations and folks who just really care about improving their business. It's a place for us to meet every week. So connect, share your best tips and tactics in the chat. Let's run through our quick introduction, announcements. So today we are talking about hot topics. And here is our link tree. So if you haven't followed us everywhere, you need to. So check out our YouTube page. We have the best clips every single week from the Ethicsverse and from the Ethics Experts, our podcast. You can check out our YouTube where we show the replays. Follow us on LinkedIn as well. There's always a bunch of great tips and comments there. Today, we're going to be giving away Humanizing Rules. This book has been flying off the shelves. This is all about merging behavioral science into your program to help drive and influence those behaviors of the human sensors in our organization. We talk about that all the time. This is a phenomenal book. We're giving away 5 of them today. Also, our good friend Allison Taylor's book just came out yesterday called Higher Ground. This is on its track to be a bestseller. We'll be featuring that in the Ethico library as well. So definitely check that out and follow her on LinkedIn. She always has something, smart and kind of pithy to say. Ecosystem is our integrated platform to help you manage more risk, improve your bottom line, and improve your culture of integrity within your organization. Check out G2 if you are interested. I'm not here to sell you. Our G2 is Yelp for ethics and compliance software. So go ahead and check that out and look at all those amazing awards that we've won. We continue to be an organization that wants to put out tools that help you do your job, not tools that you're working for, but rather tools that help you make your impact. And we do that with insights from people on the front lines like you and from, with great service. That's our whole angle. We have a bunch of books, like I said. So if you get chosen today, you don't have to pick Humanizing Rules. You can pick any of the books from the library. I just got Tom Fox's book, the kids' book, in the mail the other day. So I'm going to be reading that to my kids, and maybe I'll film that, and you guys can check that out. But a bunch of great books out right now, a bunch of great podcasts out as well. So if you haven't checked out the Great Women in Compliance podcast, I really encourage you to do it. Literally every single episode is phenomenal. There's such smart people on there, such great insights that I gather from every single one of those episodes. So if you haven't checked that out, do it. Check out the Compliance Podcast Network, where you can find the Ethics Experts and the GalloCast as well. Our 1 free year of service is still live in effect. So if you are interested in seeing what else is out there, but you're really concerned about the change management and how you're going to land that plane, we solve that for you with a free year of service. So you can hit that QR code and hit a demo if you're interested in learning some more about that. And finally, look at that, superhero. How's it going? That's me. I'm Nick. Here is the one and only Matt Kelly with cape draped over shoulder, and the one and only Karen Moore. Karen, you're looking good. You're looking like you have your, this is your disguise. You're wearing your disguise today.
Yeah, I just do not look like that in real life. I wish I did. Only in the Ethicsverse.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Nick, for giving us all of the intro. And hello, everybody. Welcome to another Ethicsverse session. Thank you all for joining us here today. So Karen, Nick, and I had been talking about and drawing up a bunch of recent events within the last 3 months or so to try and talk about today. We have a few items from the anti-corruption realm, both new laws and enforcement actions that we want to discuss. We have a few items on artificial intelligence, which again are both new rules and regulations that are worth looking at, and enforcement actions on AI to discuss. We have a couple of different issues around speak up culture, enforcement actions, a Supreme Court ruling about whistleblower retaliation that I wanted to ask people about. And even because I saw some of the listeners chiming in from as far away as Switzerland and London, please note, we will have a couple of issues that we wanted to cover from the EU and from the UK. So we've got a lot that we do want to cover here. And as always, all of you attending, if you have good questions you want to ask or good observations, pop them into the attendee chat and we will try and tackle those as quickly as we can. So all of that said, I did want to start with anti-corruption, and I will start with the big news of a recent anti-corruption enforcement action against SAP, German software company, that was in total fined $220 million for bribery misconduct offenses that were happening in South Africa, East Africa, Azerbaijan, and I think a total of 7 countries. I may be forgetting some further off in Asia. But out of that, 220 million, 118 million was a criminal penalty. However, the company did not get a compliance monitor, even though this was SAP's second FCPA violation in 10 years and its third corporate enforcement resolution in that period too, because just 2 years ago, SAP settled a national security violation with the Justice Department on export controls sanctions, if I remember correctly. So we had a whole bunch of recidivist behavior. We have a big FCPA case, and yet we do not have a compliance monitor. So I wanted to start there. And Karen, let me put it to you, because I know you have thoughts about this. You have told me you have thoughts. What are we supposed to make of this big case? First big one of the year. What jumps out to you?
Well, it's the first one of the year, but it's not the first one where we see the joint SEC and DOJ findings and actions to be, let's say, on the lenient side, at least from my perspective. And I'm a person who has the utmost respect for the complexity and the difficulty of operating effective compliance programs in a large corporation. So, that's what it is. And SAP doubtless has a fantastic program today. The DOJ in its publication even noted the extreme amount of remediation they've undertaken since the investigation began. And yet we see a recidivist organization, like you said, this is their third strike, no monitor, a huge discount off the very bottom of the sentencing guidelines recommended fines. We see a lot of other credits happening. There's, I think, a small credit for some executive clawback, credits for anything that's going on being paid to the South African or to the Indonesian enforcement authorities. And so, I just sometimes I don't get it. There was no voluntary self-disclosure here, and the credits still started rolling in. So I'm a little perplexed at the distinction between what the DOJ says it wants to do and then what we see it doing. On top of which, by the way, just no individual enforcement either. So I didn't see any. Maybe I missed something. I didn't see any individuals getting for their accountability here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty puzzling when you look at it. I mean, the only thing I could perhaps think of is like the remediation they've done. I just don't know though. It doesn't really add up to me.
I was going to ask Karen along those lines. Yeah, do you have any observations about the remediation they did? Because I know that they invested a lot in data analytics, and I know that they changed their bonus structure for dealing with high-risk transactions. Actually, I think they eliminated it for high-risk parties. But I don't know if you have any color you could give us about all of that.
No, I think it's phenomenal. And like I said, I don't doubt that today SAP is running a really top-notch compliance program. But it was given a roadmap really by the investigation on the things that had to be done. And now they're doing them, which is great. So maybe we don't see a fourth, investigation underway in the next few years because they finally kind of button things down. There was also extreme cooperation. The DOJ lists of, the many, many things they did. One of the things that jumped out at me that tends to get overlooked was the vast amount of translations that SAP provided to the DOJ, which is, very, very costly. I kind of love the idea that you can control the translation, because we know translation is not perfect, and I'm not suggesting anything there, but you undertake that expense and that effort and provide the DOJ with vast amounts of translated documents, and that's an extremely helpful component of the investigation that often gets overlooked. They provided all of their people. So yes, remediation, fantastic. Cooperation, fantastic. But a bad act is a bad act. So I'm still kind of missing the point here. I do know that some people have said they didn't take advantage of the voluntary self-disclosure. Their fines could have been even lower. But there you need to point out that recidivism is considered an aggravating factor, and an aggravating factor requires an immediate disclosure, not a timely disclosure. And even though there's kind of discussion about what does timely mean, immediate sounds pretty clear. So that might not have been really realistically available to them.
One thing that jumped out to me about what SAP did for remediation, and what Albemarle also did for remediation with its big settlement, which was last year, I think last September or so, is that both of them have implemented these fundamental changes to how they work with distributors and resellers. Like Albemarle got rid of it on a worldwide scale. They don't do agents and intermediaries for global sales anymore. They were an oil refinery sort of a business, or they sold chemicals to refineries, and they worked with a lot of resellers. And they said, no more. Albemarle now just does direct sales. And that is a fundamental and really kind of irreversible change to how you operate. It's a big deal. SAP also doing the same, that they were working with, I think it was a bonus to third parties that helped with sales. And they said no more of a bonus system for compensation for third-party agents and resellers. That's gone. So we now have two cases where they're taking these irreversible substantive changes to how they work. And that can't have been done without the board looking at it and saying yes. And I keep coming back to, this is going to be part of it now, is that it really is about the company's going to have to change how it exists, change its fundamental shape to be able to get on the DOJ's good graces. I don't know, Nick, what do you think about this? And companies need to really, they're going to have to drink the Kool-Aid now as opposed to just paying.
Totally. Well, it's interesting, right? Standard Oil, for example, is a great example of a company that just had a fully integrated supply chain, right? That's how they kind of got so big and became so famous and had so much success. And then we saw over kind of the middle to latter part of the last century this massive sort of disintegration of supply chains, right? The name of the game was specialization and just-in-time inventory and all these things, which sort of broke, an integrated supply chain into all these different, component pieces. And you look at, I read something recently about, the number of vendors that are involved with the 737 or something, and it was a comically high number, thousands and thousands of vendors to do all these different parts and all these different pieces. To your point, in the face of this disintegration, there's been this overlay of, an expanding scope of responsibility that, an organization has for this supply chain that touches them. And I know we're going to talk some more about that here in a minute, but it does feel like sort of the pendulum perhaps has swung, maybe as far as we might see it in our lifetime from a disintegration of supply chain perspective. And I think some of that specialization might begin to be absorbed back into mothership organizations, as evidenced, by these two examples that you just talked about. At some level, an organization has to exist within, the confines of, what's likely, what electrical fence they're likely going to get shocked by. You know what I'm saying? And to the extent that the DOJ et al. Are signaling this new level of responsibility, I think when it gets up to the board, level, there's just kind of that buy versus build or ROI type discussion to say is this even worth opening us up for the reputational risk or the, actual regulatory fine risk to even engage with all these third parties? Or should we really kind of dial in and control delivery to the end, because we are in fact, responsible until the end of the transaction?
I hadn't even thought about Boeing and its issues with its MaxJet, but it's of a similar story, a similar piece that this is more about good risk management than regulatory compliance. That if you work in this very distributed manner, that's a lot of distributed risk that you might not know you have. And are we going to have to bring that back in? I
do want to add there, that whole supply chain due diligence and understanding. I mean, that can be a common thread through a lot of the topics we wanted to discuss today, because there's more and more pressure to really understand who you're doing business with and forging those relationships, understanding who they are. But in this kind of agency world where we've got the SAP, we have Albemarle and countless other examples, it's also a question, I believe, in the global arena of some collective action in some of these markets, because there are so many markets where you cannot work but through an agent, and you have no choice. You are pressured into these relationships where due diligence is just going to get you a limited result, and you can't, as a company, end up backed into a corner position where you're like, well, can I even do business in this country? So that kind of collective action to try and change some of the established customary ways of doing business, I think, it weighs also very heavily in how this plays out going forward.
All right. Now, the other anti-corruption news I wanted to touch on today was the enactment here in the United States of the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which apparently we are abbreviating now as FEPA, which outlaws or makes it a crime for a foreign government official to accept a bribe or to solicit a bribe from a U.S. interest, from a person, from a company, anybody listed on a U.S. exchange. So basically, it's criminalizing the other part of the Bribery Act that the FCPA already did. It criminalized offering the bribe or paying the bribe. Well, what about the bribe taker? Finally, now we have outlawed that for the bribe taker, the foreign corrupt official. My first question is actually to all of the listeners here. How many of you have heard that this law has been enacted in the United States? It went into effect at the end of December, and we haven't had any prosecutions of it yet, but just at the awareness level, I don't know, yes, you've heard of it, no, you haven't. If anybody just wants to pop in on the chat and let us know, how much is this on your radar screen at all? But the question that I have for Karen and then also for Nick is, I'm wondering, what would the existence of this law mean for a company's FCPA program, FCPA? So, for example, if you are under investigation for an FCPA violation, you've paid a bribe. Well, by definition, that means there is a FEPA violation out there somewhere because somebody took it. So right. If this spirit of Justice Department, we expect full cooperation if you want a nice settlement on your FCPA violation, does this now mean you're going to have to cooperate with them prosecuting the government official? Or what if you get solicited for a bribe, but you haven't paid it? Are you supposed to report that to the DOJ? Do you keep it in your back pocket? And then when you get nailed on something else, you say, look, I can help you with this FEPA violation, but I want a resolution over here on this other thing. Can we work together? I suddenly think there's a whole lot of complication about this. And I'm trying to figure out what a compliance officer needs to do to live with FEPA in the world here. And Karen, what are your early thoughts about this law?
Yeah, those are all such good questions, and I have them too. But looking at this first, I think important to note that the FEPA and the FCPA are mutually exclusive. Yep. You can get dinged for the FCPA violation, and then the person requesting or soliciting the bribe can. So it's the supply chain and the demand side. The supply side and the demand side that are involved here. So my question is most definitely, do you start to have a kind of whistleblower strategy when you are being solicited? Or are you just relying on your very strong internal compliance program to say, I may have been solicited, but I'm turning them down and there my obligations stop. I'm not exposed on the FCPA side, and I've prevented the supply side from being realized, even though the solicitation itself is a FEPA violation. So I think for compliance officers, it's really examining, are we giving that message strongly enough? On the one hand, to really make sure that early days we are knowing how to deal with the solicitation. I suppose if something has happened, then it becomes a question of what's our strategy? Do we come forward in the kind of voluntary self-disclosure arena and use that disclosure of the demand side in our negotiations with the DOJ? There's no SEC component to FIPA that I'm aware of. So I think that on the one hand, the other thing for compliance officers with FIPA, as we mentioned, is this whole concept of who's a foreign government official, which is slightly expanded under FIPA versus the FCPA, so may not be sufficiently covered, but gets right back into the agency question. These kind of unofficial representatives of foreign governments are covered under FIPA. So if we're dealing with agents, even under some scheme where we're kind of forced to deal with an agent, if they're not clearly independent, we also may be in this very complex situation where bribes are being solicited even by our third-party partners, and they then may fall under FIPA and drag us down with them.
Yeah. Nick, what do you think about what becomes more important for a compliance program to do right, given this change in circumstance with FIPA now hanging around out there?
I think like training, they have to do right. I think there's probably going to be a lot of policies that they're going to have to adjust and a lot of new guidance that they're going to have to provide, especially for people that are in high-risk jurisdictions or on the front lines. They're going to have to get that right for sure. I think they also can get right if they want the sort of strategic element that this can bring into like expanding the program or making it a little bit more impactful. Like there's a couple of things we're talking about today that are easy entry points for a broader kind of board conversation or an executive conversation to get that kind of an endorsement, because we're seeing some really clear signals from these regulatory bodies on what they care about and the expanding scope, again, back to the third party discussion, the expanding scope of responsibility. And then in the context of FIPA, the expanding scope of responsibility across both the demand and the supply side of these interactions. I mean, they knew when they put this out that there was like lack of clarity around what a foreign official is. They know when they put it out that like the enforceability of this is like greatly like under question. Like, idiots didn't write this, you know what I'm saying? So like in spite of those kind of complexities and like the knot, the sort of jurisdictional or like legal knot that this might create, this was put out for some reason. And I think it just goes back to, providing a pretty clear signal on what they care about, what they're kind of getting annoyed with, and where they want to push the onus or where they want to push the responsibility. And that's down to the business level.
Yeah. So we're getting some great questions and comments here on FIPA. So one person here, Faisal, asking, the foreign government officials have to be present in the U.S. to be prosecuted under FIPA, correct? Yes, that is correct, to be prosecuted. But the United States has a long history of indicting foreign government officials with really no practical hope. These people are never going to get extradited to the United States. But when you think of Chinese military officers who have been indicted for cybersecurity attacks, Russians who have been indicted for similar offenses, that trial is never going to see the light of day. But they might still have diplomatic needs where like indicting them still makes sense from a geopolitical standpoint for the U.S. Amy McDougall, who is a former federal prosecutor, who pointed out that, yes, the Justice Department probably would expect you to cooperate with a FIPA investigation, saying this can get ugly pretty fast. Also pointing out that if you're under a DPA, could there be a circumstance where you would have to then disclose any bribe that solicitation that you receive? I think, Amy, that is an excellent point. I would not be surprised to see that. My other question, well, I got a ton of questions, but first, clearly, Justice Department, if any of them are on this call quietly on this webinar, we need speeches from you. We need speeches from DOJ about how they plan to handle this. I think there's a lot of people very thirsty for knowledge, but I could easily see a scenario where you report to the DOJ, we received this bribe solicitation, but we didn't pay it. Well, their natural next question would be, how do we know that as a prosecutor? And could this open an internal control can of worms that, how are we going to confirm that you never paid this bribe that we didn't know about until you self-disclosed it to us? There are a dozen different ways this could get messy, and I have no idea what's going to come of it. But clearly, the Justice Department will need to step up and help us understand what are we doing here.
I also, just on the indictment, I just am wondering if we don't see now even more collaboration between the DOJ and their foreign counterparts, so that if
Yes.
you're learning of a violation, you just maybe pass it on for prosecution in the relevant country if they've got, anti-bribery statutes that track the solicitation.
We have one question from somebody asking about third-party sales commissions and how they are routinely a vehicle for FCPA violations. Do you see third-party sales commissions being eliminated as a result of enforcement in the U.S. For the life sciences company? This person asks. I know several compliance officers who would say, please God, yes, to that question. I mean, they would love it. I don't know that I've ever actually seen that as part of a life sciences settlement, but we're seeing it here and there. But Karen, I don't know if you have any thoughts about these third-party sales commissions. I think a lot of people would like just to get rid of them if they could. I don't know if they can.
Yeah, I'm in the dear God, please. But the compliance officers are not running the business. We also have to, understand and support what the realities of getting business done. But I do think it helps companies challenge and re-examine their established conduits and maybe come up with better and more manageable substitutions to commissions. And certainly some of the recent cases have taught us that a very close eye on the amount of the commission and how it's being paid, and is it comparable to similar commissions paid in the industry or in even other industries for similar types of representation, to at least at a minimum try and calibrate those commissions. But yes, dear God, please get rid of these third-party sales commissions. That would make everybody's life better. And these huge cases, I do have a lot of sympathy for Albemarle and SAP and the others. They're a cautionary tale for the rest of us, aren't they? They're real guideposts to say what are the things we need to be looking at within our own organizations before things fall apart.
Okay.
The thing on FIPA that I would have liked to see is like maybe some more guidance on whistleblower protections, especially in like some of these jurisdictions where those whistleblower protections aren't just kind of inherent,
Yes. Oh, and one more FIPA detail, and then I'm going to move on to AI. But I do know as part of the law, the Justice Department will eventually be publishing basically reports or annual directories of foreign government officials they know are corrupt. So think about what that means. Now,
new lookbook coming out.
Libel actions.
If you know you're dealing with these third-party agents, you're working in these countries, but you somehow miss the fact that, well, if the DOJ knew that they were corrupt, but you didn't, that's not going to be a good look. So there's going to be, I think, maybe more due diligence pressure that comes out of this as well.
Is that going to be a defense, though, Matt? It's like, oh, they weren't on the list. So, we did our due diligence. If, you guys didn't put them on there, we kind of guess they're okay.
Like I said, I look forward to the fact patterns that let us debate all of this in more detail, because there are 100 different ways this law could implicate compliance programs. All right, artificial intelligence, chapter 2, issue 2. So not long ago, we had some new proposed regulations from New York. The State Department of Financial Services proposed new regulations for how AI is used in the insurance sector. And for everybody thinking, why do I care? I'm not in insurance. My company doesn't do business in New York. I would still advise that go dig up what New York DFS has proposed for insurers, because it makes a lot of sense for any industry. The proposals are all about you will have to inventory all the ways your company is using AI. You will have to explain how you assess the risks of, say, bias in AI and how you look at the underlying data the AI is learning from. You will have to state all of the internal controls you have for your AIs to make sure that they are working as intended, and how you test the results to make sure that they make sense. And I'll stop right there, but just to say, like, this seems like good common sense stuff. Any industry, any business, any state, any country, this is what you should be thinking through with AI, about how you're governing a new technology and making sure it's working as intended. but I question whether a lot of companies have skillfully done so far, been able to implement these governance practices for AI or anything else. Karen, what do you think about this challenge here of figuring out how you get a grip on the technology you're using?
Yeah, I think that you put the finger right on it, is what technology are we using? How are we employing AI? Because I do think when you start down that path, you realize that it's far more pervasive, either within the organization or within the supply chain or other relationships than you think. It's much broader than you think. And AI has been around for a long time. So this is not a question of onboarding new technology. It's examining what you're already using and then trying to decide or even discover what kind of standards should you be applying, which I think right now is largely in anticipatory mode rather than reactive, unless you're providing insurance services to New York State and then some other very specific and defined instances. My big sadness and fear is that unless the FTC really grabs onto this, we're going to end up with the same privacy situation that we're in now, where every state's going to come online with its own version, and we're going to have to try and swim through all of that, not to mention what's going on outside. Which is why we're looking so closely at the draft EU AI Act to see if, like with privacy, we can at least get some baseline guidance on what we should be doing. Because trying to comply with it all for most companies, especially if you're not a really large company, it's just mind-boggling the amount of resources we're going to have to throw at this to unravel the regulatory environment. So I'm feeling kind of like I did with privacy in the early days and ongoing, which is I need to up my supply of brown paper bags for when I start to hyperventilate. You just got to do your best and operate on kind of fundamental principles that have been established to guide you.
So Nick, help me out here, because one thing that bugs me about how I think some companies are probably going to approach this, like what Karen said, will we wind up with a patchwork of different regulations over AI? I kind of want to tell these companies, who cares? That's not the point. AI is a very risky thing, period. And you need some good way to govern this very powerful science project that we're all playing with now before it blows up in your face. But I don't know that companies, do they either see it in that way, or do they not know how to put these guardrails around it, regardless of what the regulations say? I mean, there's certain common sense risk management that I don't think is happening here.
Yeah, I think it's, it might be like a little bit of like the other guy syndrome, or maybe it's just people don't get it.
Yeah.
I mean, it is, it's hard to imagine like our lives without cell phones now. I know this is like such a trite kind of comparison, but there was a point in time where like my dad was going on dates with my mom, thank you very much, without a cell phone. Okay. So they were somehow able to like coordinate, and there's all these kind of complications that come from it. There's going to be such a wild expansion of AI in all areas of our lives, in all aspects of our jobs. They're going to be influenced by it in one way or another. And I just think, the size of that destination, the scope of that destination is probably like a lot smaller in most, people's minds. And it's probably a lot further away than most people think, I think we're going to blink and it's all going to be done for us, Maybe we'll be floating around like on Wall-E on those chairs with Slurpees, those floating lazy boy, things. So that's kind of one aspect of it. The other aspect that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, kind of to your point, Matt, this is a big risk, and this is like a sword, and, a lot of us are treating it like a butter knife. And so I think it's probably going to really come down not to managing it with like more constriction. Well, maybe this is a bad audience to say this, but really maybe back to what Karen was saying, really on principles. And I think it's going to come down to like training, and do people know how to utilize the tool, and do people know how to utilize it responsibly? I just think like AI as a problem is so amorphous. And then we see these examples, I'm just saying from like a cognitive standpoint, we see these examples of like, oh, okay, it's Rite Aid's using AI to, find shoplifters. We don't even we don't even have a retail store. We're not using AI for anything like that. Thus, AI is not a risk for our organization. But to Karen's point again, it's being used throughout the organization. There are,
Yes.
there are innovative people in every single role in every single department who are tinkerers, and they like the new technology, and they're figuring out ways to bring it in. And I'm saying all that to say this. I was talking to a buddy last week, and he runs a pretty good sized company. And one of his OKRs for this year is to have 40 hours of AI prompt engineering training for everybody in the organization. So he's kind of going the other way with it, of like leaning into it and saying, we're going to just do a ton of training on this, because the smart people in these roles are going to understand those risks that they're faced with. And they're going to, if they're enabled more and empowered more, we're not going to get caught. This is the theory. We're not going to get caught with some unknown risk. We're not going to be blindsided by some unknown risk, right? So he's kind of trying to turn on those human sensors. And then as these sort of regulatory constraints end up coming in, he thinks that his organization will be better equipped to like navigate through it. But I don't really know, like that's kind of at least an innovative answer, or like an innovative way that I have heard somebody kind of attacking this, this impending tsunami of like AI kind of washing over our operations,
Here's another question from the audience. Does anyone really truly grasp the full spectrum of the risks of AI? I think the risks aren't well understood. So the answer to that question is no. Nobody understands the full risks of AI. And I will even put aside the Terminator taking over and exterminating humans risk, like just the business risks of how this works. No, I don't think anybody's figured it out. But at least the New York DFS regulations, they're kicking the conversation into effect that, all right, insurer, explain to us how you're trying to think about this. And these are proposed regulations. They might wind up in a final version looking very different. But I think the objective here is to get companies not to say, well, we haven't thought about it at all.
Right.
And to force them to say something, and then they will start to take it seriously.
Well, and that touches on something that I was going to say before. It's almost like this guidance is just like, here's how to think. Think through these things. You know what I'm saying? And, if the regulation is merely a catalyst or a mechanism to get organizations to start thinking through it, I mean, that's a fine first step. But it seems like in risk assessments, or like whenever there's a new piece that's, found its way onto the board, you have to kind of reassess everything. And I think the real work there is kind of going through the thought experiment and crowdsourcing all these, new risks that could come up from something like FIPA or from, AI use or whatever. But if you're not thinking through it, then you're only ever going to react to something that has gone wrong,
Mm-hmm. I did want to, Nick, since you mentioned Rite Aid, that was the enforcement action around AI that I wanted to touch on generally. So the Federal Trade Commission, I think it was in December, told Rite Aid that it can no longer use facial recognition technology it had been trying to use in the 2010s to identify potential shoplifters. A customer would come into the store, they would capture that customer's facial image and then compare it to a database of known shoplifters that Rite Aid had already built. If it was a match, then a employee at the store would get an alert to their cell phone. Please go intercept this person, escort them out of the store, keep an eye on them, call the police, whatever. But first off, this was done in the 2010s, and ChatGPT, when we say AI, we always think ChatGPT. Karen, to your point, this has been around since before ChatGPT. This all happened long before we started hyperventilating about generative AI. But the FTC's complaint was that they lacked technical controls. So the images in your database were not necessarily high quality. They didn't test the amount of false positives where you're flagging a customer as a shoplifter improperly. They didn't measure that over time to see if the AI was learning to do that less or not. The FTC was upset about improper employee training and some employees using that system without being trained at all. And what stuck out to me was that these are basic block and tackle internal control practices that AI has nothing to do with those mistakes. It happened to be AI, but you could have improperly trained them on any number of things, and you'd have the same sort of situation. Rite Aid did discontinue this program a couple of years ago. I think they objected to the ban on it. They're not too happy with the Federal Trade Commission's interpretation of events. However, we are where we are. That's the FTC said you can't use this. But Karen, talk to me a little bit about all of this, because as I said, I think this is basic block and tackle that compliance and HR teams need to do. AI seems to be the issue of the moment, but it's only the issue of the moment.
Yes, and I also think it's easy to get a little bit, I hesitate to use the word hysterical, but oh my God, you can't use facial recognition to control, theft and pilfering, which is a really huge issue for retail stores. It's really, where's the thoughtfulness behind it? Where are you using AI appropriately as a tool to address the problem that you've got? Because it is usable. In this case, there were so many problems, partly just, 2010, the technology wasn't so sophisticated, in which case maybe you have to say we're not there yet. We don't have the technology appropriate for this. But they did it in their retail stores. They deployed it in places that were low income, racially diverse. So it was kind of tactically very biased already. It also wasn't just using databases of known shoplifters, but asking employees, look, if there's somebody suspicious, let's put them in the database. So they were encouraging their employees to make their own evaluation. People making minimum wage at the checkout counter, making an evaluation of, oh, that person looks suspicious, let's enter them in the database for future observation. And then the confidence levels, I think, were not displayed so that it wasn't, showing up to an employee, oh, this person entered, they're in the database, but our confidence level that that person matches our database is high, and therefore action may be warranted. So there were all sorts of problems with the technology and the way the technology was being deployed. So it's not, should we deploy this type of technology, but how can we do this in a thoughtful manner that understands all of the open risk areas, the faults with the data set, the faults with the way it's being deployed, the way that people are being trained to react to it. And that's where I really think, just like with data privacy, with which this intersects really heavily, you have to think of what is fair to the individual who is going to be subject to the negative reaction here. What is a way that is transparent to them, fair to them, where the technology is being used appropriately. So it's not, let's try and put back into a box a bunch of stuff that's already out there, but how can we use that in a responsible manner that takes into consideration all the downsides, and then weighs, do the downsides justify the use of this technology at all in this circumstance?
It's funny. I didn't know the detail that sometimes employees were taking pictures of customers to add that to the database because they made a subjective judgment that maybe this person is a risk. But imagine a world where the accounting department tells sales cashiers, you can just use your own judgment on whether a sale has closed or not. The entire accounting department would be fired. The head of finance would be probably executed in the parking lot to warn everybody else how bad an idea this is. So this is where I get stuck, is that in many different ways, if you look at the internal controls for other stuff, well, of course, we would never allow this for the other things. So why are we allowing it with AI? And Nick, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that. I know that you've worked in auditing and internal control before. I'm just stuck on how come we can't take those audit internal control best practices and kind of clone them and mainstream them across the rest of the enterprise?
Well, I think that's actually right. I think that's the answer. There's always going to be risks that you don't have handled. There's always balancing sort of compliance and innovation is like a challenge for every organization, right? So, there's always going to be things that you haven't figured out yet, or, whatever. There's always going to be knocks in the engine or whatever. I'll tell you, in a financial auditing perspective, if an auditor comes in to a business and it's the first time they're looking at that business, they're trying to get the lay of the land and understand, is this a burning dumpster fire? Do they have this dialed in? They're going through a human subjective exercise themselves of looking at this evidence. And I'm just saying, for any time we get a new auditor, we're always like, here are our internal controls. Here's a list of, the problems with these controls that like we've identified. Here are the things that like we're working on in order to like alleviate those known problems that we have. That sends a very clear message to the auditor that, we're about our business and we're trying to, improve things, right? We're looking for opportunities to increase quality of this particular operation. And if you can use that as a corollary in this situation, I mean, there's a bunch of known like holes in that process. You guys listed 5 of them right off the bat. People, sending text messages to some, database. That sounds like absolutely nuts, right? So those are easily identifiable like holes in that process or holes in the quality of that process that, if they were actually trying to improve it, they could have, listed those things and, presented a more compelling case to, the regulatory body that ended up issuing this fine. But, back to your broad point, Matt, like we already have all these frameworks. We already know how to navigate through something like this, right? Like where there's unknown risks or where there's risks we haven't identified or not quantified and so forth. The simple sort of basic application of those principles to these new, nascent fields that are developing is at least a great first start, right? Like it's at least a great first step to start to mitigate the risk and start to kind of sort through it versus, again, waiting for something to just go wrong.
Yeah. All right. So in the interest of time, I wanted to move on to a couple of other issues and squeak them in the last 15 minutes or so. But Karen, you had wanted to talk about the EU's Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which I believe is in a state of flux at the moment. But what is going on with that? What is the flux?
Yeah, so the act, it's actually a directive. What has kind of fallen at the last hurdle. So really expected to be adopted and then received some objections by Germany, which brought in a few other countries alongside, and just a few days ago now has been postponed. I don't think indefinitely, but to try and figure out whether this is something that can be implemented in its current version. And it is a directive that imposes a tremendous burden, which was at least Germany's stated objection, or one of Germany's coalition government parties actually drove the objection. Because it puts a lot of burden on doing your due diligence in the supply chain for a whole range of human rights related issues, and not just your direct supplier, but their suppliers and their suppliers and their suppliers, to the point where, if you are buying blueberry muffins for your office breakfast, you need to know where the blueberries were harvested. It can get to that kind of level of ridiculousness and puts yet another burden on third-party due diligence on something that's already, in my opinion, overburdened with issues on the cyber side, on the privacy side, on financial health, on anti-corruption tendencies, everything. It's become an almost impossible due diligence. But I wonder here whether Germany isn't objecting because they already are at the forefront of a supply chain due diligence law. They already have a supply chain act in place, which is burdensome enough, but much more reasonable than what the EU directive is imposing. And let's remember that a directive in the EU doesn't become law. What it does is require transposition into national law in each one of the 27 member states. So we're going to end up with 27 different versions of this act, but it would require Germany to up the ante on its own act to meet the minimum requirements of what's being called the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Act. And I didn't do this just for this purpose, but my husband and I are taking German classes, German language classes. I do want to encourage everybody to go back to the bottom of a learning ladder in anything, because it actually is very eye-opening for compliance officers who are kind of usually at the top of the ladder to understand what it's like to learn something for the first time. And so I did want to, so I can take a snippet of this from my German teacher, say that the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, also known as the, and this is one word.
I want a massive round of applause for this. I want a massive round of applause for this if we like it. Okay, go.
Okay, I'm going to do it one more time here with my best appropriate pronunciation. The Lieferkettensorgfaltspflichtengesetz. That's the LKSG. If there are German speakers out there, please
really
give me a little bit of leeway there. But I think it is a question now of Germany saying, we've got something workable. Why would we want to support something that's going to make it almost unworkable, not just for German companies, but for companies doing business in Germany, including our big US supply chain partners who are going to have to try and comply with all these requirements. So I just put that out there because the CSDDD will come back. It's only been suspended until things can be worked out, maybe with a few modifications. And then also just to point out that it does not affect the already implemented CSRD, which is the Reporting and Transparency Act in the EU, which kind of akin to what we're talking about here with the SEC requirements. You know, if you're going to say you're doing something, you better report and prove that you're doing it.
And also to point out that you could read that word and pronounce it. So that was great. That was so good. So is the main difference, though, between the German one and the other one just the org size difference, 3,000 versus 500?
Yeah, it's the org size difference, but it's also the list of things that you are required to conduct due diligence on. It's the appointment of another officer. I just can see the chief compliance officer's title getting longer and longer and longer. Right now, you're going to be also the human rights officer as well as the privacy officer and the compliance officer. So there's smaller companies with more reporting requirements and further down the supply chain. I guess those are some of the big differences.
I mean, that axiom, though, of every action has an equal and opposite reaction is just so interesting because you just see it everywhere, right? Like getting back to that supply chain disintegration thing, that was all sort of the broad theory behind it, is that's going to drive out a lot of deadweight loss. It's going to let people be more efficient and so forth. And it's interesting that now there's sort of these compensatory proposed positions that need to be created in order to establish some more of that sinew that would have been in place if it were just one body,
Well, and how many more questions, Nick, can you add to a due diligence questionnaire? And then try and audit them for accuracy.
Yes.
It's almost impossible, to try and now get the environmental, the privacy, the cyber, and then then the bribery, all the kind of compliance side things. And then, you want to know that they're financially solvent and operating a reasonable business. I just don't know. I really feel for our procurement colleagues.
So and now if you want muffins, you got to have a little blueberry garden out back.
Well, I want to know that my blueberries are, being sustainably grown and picked by people who are being paid a fair wage, and et cetera. Yeah.
Blueberries are native to New England, where I am, so I'm perfectly fine with that.
That's fine. That's good to go.
So the last thing that I wanted to try and cover, one of the last, was pretaliation. And first, I guess I'll put another question out to the listening audience. How many of you believe you are now familiar with what pretaliation risk is and its enforcement by the Securities and Exchange Commission? Are you, yes, you are confident, or no, you don't quite know what this is?
So pretaliation is when I kind of ground my son because I think he's going to do bad on a test.
So for a long time now, for the last 7 years or so, the SEC has been enforcing against companies for pretaliation clauses that restrict an employee's ability to report misconduct to a regulator, where you might have an agreement that says, if you want severance, here's your big severance package. You have to sign away all your litigation rights or whatnot, which is fairly routine. And then the tricky clause had been, and you may not report to any outside party, period, including regulators, without company's permission. And the SEC said that is pretaliation. You are constraining their ability to report to regulators. And they had not really fined anybody considerable amounts of money, $100,000, $200,000, maybe about $1 million or so for many years. But then within the last 2 or 3 months now, we have had 2 interesting pretaliation enforcement actions. First, late last year, there was an enforcement action against a financial services firm for pretaliation clauses it had used with its employees, and the fines went from a couple of $100,000 to $1 million to $10 million. That's a considerable amount of money. And then just the other week, the SEC sanctioned JP Morgan Securities First off, $18 million. So now we've raised the bar again. That's the biggest retaliation we've seen. But they specifically faulted JP Morgan for its contracts and confidential settlements with customers, not employees. They have now expanded. It's not just employees. You might also have these constrained language terms in a contract with customers, where if they received a settlement or a credit of $1,000 or more, then they could not report anything to a regulator. If you got a subpoena, you could answer it, but you can't go to the SEC first without alerting JP Morgan in advance. And the SEC took action over that. And for both of these two firms, JP Morgan and D.E. Shaw was the other one, they had this problematic language as recently as last summer, when retaliation enforcement began in 2016. So I'm still stuck on, because I've seen a fair number of people here saying no, where I'm not quite familiar with retaliation yet. I'm stuck on how widely known is this risk now? How difficult is it really to just clean up your contract language? And Karen, what do you think of all this and how challenging it could be?
Yeah, well, I think clearly not widely understood, or JP Morgan wouldn't have found itself in this difficulty. I suspect possibly that just got a kind of copy paste from some other provisions. You can't get somebody to waive their right to bring forward a concern about a criminal violation or a security violation. So they I think they were just misguided. To begin with, there was no evidence, I don't believe, that they ever tried to enforce that. But
no.
My bigger question here, what really lit up a light bulb for me, is that on the whistleblowing to the SEC or to other government bodies, I've always felt, that's pretty clear that you can't chill an employee's opportunity to do that, but your obligation then, or your workaround or your solution, is to make sure that you've really buttoned down internal speaking up, right? So you don't need to go to the SEC, because if you report something to us, we're going to pay attention. We're going to do something about it. Not saying you shouldn't go or you can't go, but here's an effective way to speak up, because you're going to see results. You're going to see action. But this really made me think about, what about the whole third party kind of stakeholder reporting into a company? Are we being good enough about creating those channels so that the JP Morgan customers had an opportunity to say to JP Morgan, hey, I'm not happy with that. And JP Morgan could have investigated and probably caught what, again, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, might have been a copy paste from some other type of a waiver language, and corrected it then and there before it got to an $18 million.
That is the thing that gets me, is that this is like a contract management issue at the root of it. But you have to identify, where are these contracts, what exact language, who signed them, how do we find them? Nick, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about this expanding realm of retaliation risk.
Yeah, I just, Karen kind of touched on, using third parties or accessing risk intelligence from third parties. We've seen more and more clients start to do that, to open up their intake channels to other people, other stakeholders that are touching their organization. And, we kind of always say you should be agnostic about like where you're getting a report from. Right? There's probably, orders of magnitude more risk intelligence, that exists in your organization than you're privy to. So we shouldn't care where it comes from. And there's a retaliation problem, call it post retaliation. There's a retaliation problem in every single organization. So to Karen's point, like educating people that you have a true commitment against retaliation of any kind, pre, post, whatever, and reinforcing and re-educating and retraining folks on like what their channels to speak up are, both internal and external with the SEC. I think that type of ongoing campaign, I don't see enough organizations sort of doing it and like continuing to address this thing. And I think with that kind of a campaign and expanding of scope of like channels for like risk intelligence inroads, and just really kind of trying to knock down that wall of retaliation fear in the organization, really does a lot to kind of have that hyperbolic or that kind of logarithmic sort of increase in the participation of these risk sensors in the organization. But really kind of hammering out those internal reporting mechanisms, and to Karen's exact point, that allows for you to get the benefit of the doubt that people might provide to you, but you have to take those steps.
Well, unfortunately, we are now out of time, but we covered plenty of ground. We didn't even get to, I think we got to about half of the issues that we had on deck here. But for everybody listening, thank you for joining us. Karen, as always, thank you for being the objective analyst from the sidelines, giving us plenty to think about. And if you have any other
2,100 emoji reactions. That is like a new record. So phenomenal conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Hope you join us next week. We will never waste your time. Every week on the Ethicsverse, we want to add value to you so you can go and do your job better and make your workplace better. So Matt, coolest guy in the compliance, round of applause for him. Round of applause for Karen. Guys, thank you so much for coming. Anytime you want to do these, I'm always down.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
See you guys.